put a little note. And I just got that message, and I'm sure everybody else did. I also added that little note to my name. And this is going to be the annual TDCC meeting and workshop. The meeting probably won't take a full hour, so we may be able to get to the workshop a little bit quicker. And if we're lucky, we'll be able to finish the workshop a little bit ahead of schedule. As far as the agenda goes, let's see. I'll make sure I've got this up. It's a relatively, apparently mild agenda, but some of these will take a fair amount of time. We're just going to mention some of the awards. Then we're going to have a project for test revision, review the ADMs, and then move into the workshop. Hopefully the first part will go relatively quickly, but we'll see how that goes. And sorry about the typos. I'm fixing those now. So, starting this meeting, we do have a few awards that TDCC. Oh, one reminder. If you have any questions, please write them down. We'll address them later, or you can put them in the chat. Mike Hoffpower is going to do human work and trying to monitor the chat. But I am not going to have time to really read that myself. At the end, we will be taking some questions. We're not going to try to do it a lot during the meeting.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
Are you able to enlarge your screen? There's been a request for that in the chat. Just a little hard to read.
Let's see. Let me see if I can move that.
Yeah, just enlarge the Word document. Just zoom in on your Word document.
There we go. Hopefully that's a little bit easier.
Yeah.
And thank you for letting me know that. Okay. As far as the meeting goes, here's a real quick rundown, and there's so little that I'm not even going to bother reading it. It's all right up, showing right up on the screen. The TDCC is tasked with providing the EB with as an executive board with nominations for some of the TD awards, such as TD of the Year, Lifetime TD Achievement, the regional local TD of the Year, and the regional senior TD of the Year. Those last two are more recent awards, which are designed for people in the state of the US Open or the nearby states. So, for instance, this year with it being in California, we also looked at Oregon, Arizona, and Nevada. Next year in Michigan, I'm not sure how far the adjacent states will be. Wisconsin, Indiana, and Ohio are obvious. I'm not sure if Illinois, Pennsylvania, or Minnesota will be included. That would get all the Great Lakes. Yeah, New York is a little bit far. But when we make those recommendations of for nominations to the EB itself is not obligated to simply take our recommendations automatically. They do, the EB does have the option to determine on their own who might be a better recipient. For instance, there was one year when one of our recipients had passed away. That was when we had multiples for the Lifetime TD Achievements catch-up. And one of the nominations, the recipient had passed away. So the EB opted for a living recipient to take that place. And they did at least choose that living recipient from the next one on the line among our recommendations. Just one of the little things that the TDCC does. It also handles a number of the appeals for TD decisions and actions to it to see whether or not TD is doing what he should or might need some type of reminder or even penalty to get back on track. But those are some of the bigger things that take up time. And fortunately, it's not too much time. Coming up, we're going to be doing a revision to some of the questions for the local TD and senior TD test. And the local TD also doubles as the club TD test. So I'm anticipating that we will be revising a lot of the questions to modernize some of them and clean up a little bit of the language. And hopefully down the road, be able to get enough questions out there so that we would even be able to put them online, but that's not something that's going to happen immediately. There's a lot of prep that needs to go into that. And one thing every workshop does is we review the advanced delegate motions that are applicable to the TDCC. And the ones we have this year are in most cases rules related, but I'm including them because they also have a significant impact on TDs. And I'd like to run a little poll on these motions as we go through them so that we can at least let rules and the delegates meeting know how the TDs interested in this workshop feel about these. The votes on them will have three options. One is yes, one is no. The third one is abstain, and I think that's because that's the option available in the polling software. But abstain in this case really means refer to the applicable committee to review and see whether or not it's something that we'll do probably next year. Possibly next year might be a better way of putting it. And these ADMs are first. Sorry. Dealing with how to handle the opponents of expelled players. And I'm hoping Carol will be able to handle the polling once I go through this. This is primarily because there are currently various ways that TDs might handle players expelled because of cheating. Fair play violations is more politically correct, but everybody knows what that means. And we've got current language about expelling players from a section because they were erroneously placed in that section. That's been around for a long time. And a number of TDs have been handling fair play violators in the same way, but there are some other options available as well. For instance, some people automatically give a full point forfeit win to any of the prior opponents of an expelled player, which does have, as a downside, sometimes jumping a person up above players that did not, even though jumping a person up above other players that faced a tougher field because the person was paired with having a loss for a number of rounds instead of being able to being paired against people at the level that they would have been paired if they'd gotten the win in the first place. That's one reason why the standard expelled player or standard or even standard correction of a previously incorrectly reported result allows having one score treated for pairings, which is unadjusted, for prizes rather, which is unadjusted, and then another score for when the tournament actually gets rated. So if you add at most a half a point for each of the expelled players, that follows the guidelines for players that are not in the correct rating class. If you have the full point, that runs into the possibility of people jumping up. And a third option that some TDs have used is they will review each game individually and will only adjust those games that they can prove cheating occurred in. Finally, another aspect of this ADM is whether or not to rate the results of the games that were adjusted for prize purposes. So Mike, I don't know if you want to make any further comments on this, but I think I've covered most of the arguments about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is that the tournament director is expected to make judgment. Because just like Jeff said, if you can determine that specific games were the games that the player cheated in, you can invoke the penalties on those specific games, especially if it's after the tournament. I mean, because I've run online tournaments and I can clearly tell that a player is cheating, and then the player gets ahead by a piece or two and stops using their engine. And then all of a sudden, the game gets equalized up again because the rating difference is 1,000 points between the players. So it's TDs are always expected to use their best judgment when making these things, making these kind of calls. And, if you throw a player out of a tournament, there's a reasonable chance, unless the player just out and out admits that they did something wrong, then there's a reasonable chance that your ruling is going to get appealed, because I see those pretty often, in the executive board, because all the cases come through us, and it's not unusual to see a case where a TD made a decision to throw somebody out, or score a game as a loss or something like that, and then the player who's offended, appeals to the rules committee. And a lot of times what happens is if the rules committee makes a ruling and says that the TD's judgment's kind of questionable here, then the rules committee will send those cases over to tournament director certification committee for TDCC to contemplate further action against the tournament director himself or herself. That's it, Jeff. Thanks.
And this particular ADM is more focused on what to do with the scores of the players that you may be ejecting for those fair play violations. Hopefully, if you're ejecting someone for a fair play violation, you are actually accurate in making that ejection. There are a number of organizers that defer paying prizes until after the fair play review is finished, which can be done readily for online tournaments where all the scores are kept, and with difficulty for some of the other tournaments where they collect the score sheets. But again, as far as this ADM goes, it's really pushing more towards treating the opponents of the expelled players somewhat similar to the opponents of a player removed from a section because of the wrong rating being used. So I don't know if Carol is ready to put a poll up for that. I think she is. And again, as far as this goes, a 4 vote would be essentially to treat them similar to players expelled because of their rating being wrong for the section. Against would be no. And abstain is not really abstain. It's more refer to a committee. In this case, most likely the Rules Committee.
Yeah, no, what you see here in this ADM has been used in practice in a lot of the CCA tournaments. So it's not something that, you know, we got to go figure out if it works. It's been used for over a year now. And this is why there's been some move at the NTD level. Let's just go ahead and get this kind of a thing into the book, because it seems to be working just fine in practice.
Give it about another 30 seconds for everyone to vote.
You know, we've got 135 participants in this, with 95 having voted.
Somebody's asking the overview. I would recommend you scroll up in your chat. There's a note there's a link you can click on, and you can look at all the, you know, you can look at all those rules right there. So you can see everything instead of, you know, people having to scroll all over just to read the message. Some people may only have one screen, so you got things blocking what's on your screen and so forth. So it's kind of,
which might be true of mine.
No, you're fine if everything's visible.
So Jeff, are you satisfied with the results?
Looks like 73% in favor of the ADM as written. 71%, sorry. 27% to refer, and 2% that are not liking the ADM as written. That's out of 103 people. So that's a fairly good sample size, total of 135 in the Zoom. Some of those might be duplicates depending on whether or not people are looking at doing both the camera and the Zoom meeting. So I think that's pretty much good. You want me to share the results? I guess I can do that.
It's already been done.
Okay. In that case, moving on to the next ADM. This is one where people are trying to get US Chess to essentially restore some of the functionality that was in the prior version of the website in MSA, so that they can make batch membership submissions. I know there were a number of tournaments where I might have to put in 34. Looks like I was temporarily muted by accident. But
yeah, Jeff, Carol's got an update that she can give you on this right here.
Okay.
Yeah, so this project has been underway for many months now and is in a testing phase. We're actually hoping to launch it later this month, but we don't want to launch it if it, one, causes more frustration than it solves, and two, if it's not reliable. But we're pretty optimistic about the format. It'll be a CSV file upload, and limited to a certain number of fields, and we hope it improves the workflow for directors and organizers who are looking to do batch membership processing.
That's nice to hear. I haven't had many cases where I've had to deal with it. But those cases where I did have to do it, having the match membership upload was quite useful a few years back. So it sounds like this is already underway. Mike, anything you want to say before we put up?
I think what'll probably happen is if it gets rolled out beforehand, and the people who put in the motion, because this actually came up last year at the delegates meeting, but or before that, the people that put in this motion, may withdraw it and say, hey, we got it working. It seems to be working just fine. So we'll see what happens. But it's like Carol said, we're about to roll it out and we'll be able to test it.
Interesting timing, because the meeting's not that far away, but yeah, if it's rolled out before the meeting, it probably will be withdrawn. And if it's not rolled out before the meeting, it sounds like it pretty much just says, please, office, keep on doing what you're planning on doing already.
Yeah, see, Tom Langland wrote in the comments about, not really sure an ADM is necessary for something like this. I concur 100%. This is an operational matter, and it was raised through operational channels by at least one tournament director, and that's what got the process started. So making it an ADM really doesn't do anything, because it's not changing the rule book or anything like that. It's not necessary to do something like this as an ADM. But still, it's getting action. That's what's the important thing.
Yeah, personally, I'd lean towards simply referring it to the EB, which is going to be the eventual overseer of it anyway. But Carol, are you ready to throw a quick poll up? A little bit more response from last time versus last time.
Right. 15 seconds for any stragglers.
Okay. So 64% yes, 33% refer to the EB. Kind of similar to the last numbers as far as percentages, but a little bit more towards referring. Okay. Moving on to the next ADM. Whoops. Sorry.
And Jeff, if it's possible to zoom in on your screen, had more requests for that.
Just a second. I need to figure out how to minimize that. As far as zooming in on my screen, unfortunately, I don't have much more I can do as far as zooming in.
I think for participants who are having trouble seeing it, if you look at the top of your Zoom window and see a drop-down menu called View Options, if you hit Fit to Window, that should help make it more readable.
For instance, right now, as far as my screen, are you seeing anything other than the Word document? Okay. Next ADM, this has come up many times over the years, back and forth. The rook touch first variation. In the past, originally, and I think this is going back a long time, decades, US chess was requiring the rook to be touched for the king to be touched first when castling, but FIDE was allowing both. Then US chess rule was changed to match FIDE, allowing the rook to be touched first. Eventually, FIDE moved to only the king being touched first, but by then we'd had so many people that grew up with rook first that we were allowing either, recommending that the rook be touched first, but allowing either. So some TDs said, well, since it's recommended, they will give a player a warning saying if you castle by touching your rook first again in this game, then they'll penalize you. Which isn't really much of a warning, since I don't know anyone who castles twice in one game and gets away with it. Then the US chess rule was changed. Actually, it was still USCF back then. Rule was changed to make it that the king had to be touched first, and there was a huge pushback. So the following year, it was changed again to allow the rook to be touched first as a variation that did have to be posted. I know that I've worked for organizers that have gone with either the king first only, or in some cases, they'll allow the variation for the scholastic section for the under 600 rated players, while the higher rated sections only had the king first option. So this ADM wants to remove the rook first variation as a possible option. Can you think of anything else about this ADM, Mike?
No, I mean, in practice, the thing I've always looked for as a director, especially working with kids, is did the castling move occur as a continuous motion? Because if you move the rook and you stop and you write down, you move, then you move the king. To me, that's not a continuous motion, because you took a break in between making the move. But if you move one and then the other, I would give the kid a warning and say, hey, look, you're supposed to move it's a king's move. You're supposed to move the king first, and you need to do that in all your games from now on, so you don't get called out by your opponent. But that's how I've always approached it.
One obvious advantage of king first is if you move your king 2 squares,
Yeah, it's clear.
then pause, and then eventually move your rook 2 squares. Well, it was kind of obvious when you moved your king what your move is going to be. Whereas if you move your rook next to the king first and then pause, it's not obvious what your move is going to be. So in any case, this ADM wants to remove the rook first option entirely, as opposed to the current situation where it has to be announced in advance, preferably posted in advance, posted on site rather, and announced on site before the tournament starts, that rook first is going to be allowed in some or all of the sections. As I said, one organizer I work with allows it in their scholastic section for under 600 rated players, but requires a king first in all of the higher rated sections. Others allow it in every section or require king first in every section. So I guess Carol might be just about ready for a poll as to whether or not you want the rook first option removed. Or whether you want to, an against vote would be to allow the rook first option to remain. For would be that the rook first option would be removed.
Yeah, I want to answer one question somebody one comment somebody made. This is not about people reading the amendments, these ADMs, because what happens is things that pass the delegates, they then get published with an effective date. So Tim just does an update to the rules and publishes that document that you usually see come out every year, like in October, November, December, or January, that has the updates to the rules based on the delegates meeting. So it's not like, oh, well, the delegates met yesterday and they voted this rule in place, so now you're castled incorrectly, you're thrown out of the tournament. Or it's not like that. It's got to wait for the rule to go into effect first.
All right. 10 seconds.
Where this has big implications is coaching, because it's usually in the scholastic ranks is where we have this issue, and it's about teaching kids the right way to play. So that's sort of it's almost in the same boat as writing the move down first. It's the same kind of an issue.
I'll deal with that later during the discussion in the workshop. That second issue you just mentioned. So 69 to remove the option, 20 to keep the option, and 11 to refer it to probably rules to review. And final ADM. This one has a lot of verbiage on it because it affects multiple rules, but the primary thrust of it is to allow tournament directors to be able to call the flag. Just like they can, and just like arbiters can in FIDE. Now, one of the upsides, of course, is that the games can be finished a little bit more quickly when players aren't really watching the flag, and you can avoid some of those issues where someone gets mated or agrees to a draw or gets stalemated and then notices that the flag is already down for their opponent and then complains that they should have won. But TD can call it, it avoids that. And of course, the downside is if the TD makes a mistake when calling it, particularly if it's not the final time control and the TD doesn't quite get it right as far as which move number they're sitting on. Right now, only the players can call their flags for under US chess rules. Under FIDE rules, arbiters can also call it, and we do have some issues with tournaments that have some of the sections FIDE rated. This isn't the only issue, and only some of the sections are FIDE rated, but this is one of them. So, big question is whether or not TD should be allowed to call flags. When the TDs were first prohibited many years ago, it was because the TDs might not be focusing on the applicable games, or way back then, sometimes TDs were not entirely unbiased in the way they would apply the rules. We've done a lot since then to avoid that. Anything else you want to add on this, Mike, or should we go straight to a poll?
I think you can go straight to a poll.
So for means you want to allow the TDs to call flags. Against means you don't. Abstain means you want to send it to probably the rules committee.
10 seconds.
Okay. 64.
Yeah, while the people are looking at the numbers on this one, Jeff, the comment I would make is one of the hardest things to do in your growth as a director is to learn not to hover over a game that really doesn't matter, simply because, hey, it's an interesting pawn ending, or it's an interesting, bishop versus knight ending. That's a waste of time as a tournament director. You need to go to the games where you got time trouble happening. And that's where you can stand there at the game and make a ruling, when you see something happening, because that's what, as a FIDE arbiter, that's what I do is I go to the games that are about to run out. I don't hang around a game that's got, that's still got plenty of play in it. Because I want to be on scene in case a flag falls, I can make the ruling.
And that is pretty much it as far as the TDCC meeting portion of this goes. At the US Open, this is usually scheduled for an hour, and this is the point where, since we have time to burn, we have various TDs discussing things, essentially sharing tips with other TDs while we're waiting for the workshop to start. Well, I don't think we need to wait. We can go straight to the workshop, and as we've done for pretty much every US Open TDCC workshop, we're going to go with Tim Just's 25 tips and go through what's involved there. And I'll add a few more at the end after this.
Yeah, see, somebody put in the chat, hey, can you give me a link to the TD tips? There is no such thing. They're in the rule book embedded within each of the rules. Usually if there's a rule, that there's a TD tip underneath it. And so the link to the changes to the rules that are on the US Chess, website, so you can download, the primary chapters of the rule book, to including the online play chapter, chapter 10. The TD tips that are affiliated with those rules are right there as part of the rules. There is no separate document. Unlike FIDE, FIDE publishes an arbiter's manual that is essentially a book full of TD tips with each rule, for each rule, as opposed to, FIDE's laws of chess. And I know because I'm on the rules commission at FIDE, FIDE's laws of chess are only the rules, period. There are no TD tips in FIDE's laws of chess. Those are in the arbiter's manual.
Yeah, Mike, actually, this is a document that Tim Just has used in the past for the TDCC workshop. And when he was maintaining his 80/20 TD site, it was actually on his site. So it's just a little checklist of things to remember. 25 things. And it's something that we might be able to put somewhere else, or even maybe incorporate them as a forum post, and on the TD forums, tournament forums, and see if we can get a moderator to pin them or add it to one that's already pinned. This is more a useful list of what TDs need to think about when they want to run tournaments and keep things organized well. And the US Open TDCC workshop is not as extensive as the 3, 4, 5 hour workshops that Tim Just has run at other tournaments, and other TDs have run at other tournaments. But that's because of time constraints, and this does at least hit the highlights.
Yeah, the 80/20 TD domain is showing that the domain is for sale.
Jeff, would it be possible for you to send me the document you're showing? A lot of people are asking for it, and we
Oh,
can
sure.
send it out after the meeting to everybody's email.
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, as far as this goes, again, 25 tips to start with. I'll add a few at the end. First tip, of course, is think like a player. There's a reason that TDs are asked to also be players, and you cannot move up past club TD unless you have an established rating as a player. You have to think about what you like as a player. Things like round starting on time, ease of registration. When you're a player, you like the TDs to be available. You like the prizes taken care of. You like skittle space. You like the tournament room to be reasonably quiet, reasonably spacious. Some people like the tournament room to be absolutely quiet with plenty of space, and unfortunately that can't always be afforded. So most are willing to go with reasonably quiet and spacious. So just think what you would like to see. You'd like to be able to enter tournaments easily. And you'd like tournaments scheduled with round times and time controls that you would feel comfortable with. And this is just a reminder to TDs to don't just do what's convenient to you as a TD, try to do something that a player would enjoy so that they would come out to your tournament. As far as posted goes, you're going to have players that will have questions a lot of the time. So if you post the answers to those questions, the round times, the prize fund, post the pairings and the standings. If you have any rules variations, like for CCA or for the US Chess National Scholastics, make sure those are posted somewhere. Having them posted on the website helps because then people can know before they even arrive what some of those variations are. How you might be handling some things might be something you'd like to post. For instance, as Mike was mentioning, TDs have handled players that write the move before making it differently. Some do nothing. Say, sure, that's fine. Others give a warning and start giving more serious penalties when it gets abused. Others might do the standard penalty right away or even remove time. So if you've got something like how to deal with writing the move before making it, and that's significant to you, then post it. Let people know what you're going to do. And again, as I said before, don't just do it on site, do it on the website as well. Make sure that when you post your pairings and standings, people know where they are. Directional signs to where the washrooms are or which doors you can use. Those are all things you can post. And that kind of segues into announce it, because you want to make your announcements at the beginning. You want to make the announcements about turning off your cell phones and whatever else you need to do with a cell phone. The more serious tournaments, people are not even going to be allowed to carry them. At a little club event, that might not be as big a consideration, and people aren't worried if a club event with no monetary prize has people carrying cell phones. In many cases, they might need to be available for family emergencies. That's not the type of interruption you want to have happen at a big tournament. Or a small little tournament, yeah, that might be fine. Now, as far as, Mike, if you ever want to interrupt as I'm going through, you can, but I'm going to try to just continue through these otherwise. As far as number 4 goes, you want to be in the tournament room at time control. If it's an increment time control, that might be a much longer period of time than otherwise. But it allows you to quickly respond to any flag claims, quickly report results of the final round, quickly react to issues that might be happening because of the time control. There's one story I've initially had slated for later down, but at one of the national tournaments where I was directing, it was near the end of the final time control. And one person was trying to claim win on time with one of those blue Cytex, while the other person still had a half an hour on the clock in the sudden death time control. And I asked if during the round they had realized the clock had not added time when they reached move 40 and they'd done it themselves. They said yes. And at that point, I said, well, we need to discuss this out of room. I'm going to flag down the floor chief. And I got the players out of the room, found the floor chief. And at that point, I said, well, what the players did is they added the extra 30 minutes in mid-game. And then when it finally hit the real end of the game, it thought it was still waiting for the final time control to start. So it added the 30 minutes to one player's clock, and he had actually flagged. And at that point, I got the very loud and vociferous outburst from that player saying, no, he didn't flag, which is why I had gotten them out of the tournament room so that it would not disturb other players while I was doing that. If you're not there to handle those immediately, you might get those outbursts in the tournament room. And you just want to make sure that you're there at the time control to handle stuff. Number 5, there, you want to think of the next generation, because TDs are not immortal. I'm 63, and 39 years ago when I started as a TD, I wasn't really one of my big thoughts, but the guy that trained me was 21 years older than me. That was one of his thoughts. Also, if you're training another TD, then there's going to be someone available to run events when you are not available. If you're on a vacation or if you're doing a different event, you don't have events that cannot be run because there's no one to do it. And it also gives you a chance to be a player instead of a TD. I've periodically been an NTD floor chief under a local TD chief TD. And that's given the local TD the chance to concentrate on chief TD issues without the distraction of having to worry about appeals from the floor. And when you're doing something like that, please make sure that you let the local TD, in some cases even club TD if the tournament is small enough, actually do that chief TD work so they can learn things. You can give them some tips, preferably beforehand, or if they ask for help for some issues, but you want them to actually do it. I'm reminded of the old saying that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. When you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime, and you do it without you having to be the one that goes out and do the fishing. So try to train someone else to be a TD so that they can take over when you're unavailable, or if you want to actually not be a TD for a tournament or two. As far as using common sense goes, sometimes you get players trying to parse the wording of a rule in some strange way that works to their favor. So use your common sense as far as the rules to go to use the rule as the way it's obviously going to be written. And also in non-rule situations, when I've had scholastic tournaments with games still going on where the parents of a kid had to leave. And you have to understand, particularly when spectators are banned, that the TD may have to go up and interrupt a game with the players still playing so that the kid can actually leave with their parents. If you find that someone misses a round and is withdrawn, then in some circumstances, you may want to just simply let them back in the tournament. I had someone who the reason they missed the evening round was because they were taken to the hospital with a heart attack. And I simply let them play the next round. I actually had to find a pairing because they got there a little bit too late to get in the regular pairings, but I was able to do something, and I let them back in the tournament. And you have to be able to realize when you have to do something like change clock times. The old blue SciTechs were famous for having people set them for 90 hours instead of 90 minutes, or for 5 hours instead of 5 minutes in blitz. That's a little bit difficult to follow that type of revised clock time and be anywhere close to being on schedule. So you have to know that, yeah, even though you're not supposed to really change the clock settings, in particularly in some of the blitz tournaments, sometimes you have to. Using uschess.org/MSA, that might be a little bit outdated. That's essentially using the player site on the website. I'm not sure if it's still called MSA anymore. I just got so used to it that I didn't even bother.
Yeah, I use it all the time, Jeff.
Yeah. But that's where you're going to see things like ratings, the expiration dates for a player, the recent tournaments the players have been in, which is helpful if you have multiple people with the same name from the state, and you're looking for which player was playing in scholastic tournaments. If you've got someone who's playing recently in scholastic tournaments, he's not the player with that name that wants to play in the senior for the state, or vice versa. It's also where you'd see if anyone was suspended. You'd actually have to go into their player profile. When you do a player lookup, it does help to speed things up if you include the state code during.
And where I find the MSA very useful is, you know, it's potential sandbagging situations. I can go back and look at rating supplements and see that, you know, some player was rated over 1400 for a very long period of time, and then all of a sudden they're well below 1400 trying to get into a certain section at a tournament. And it becomes pretty obvious when you start looking where a player may have been sandbagging. The other thing that I find it useful for is sometimes directors are put in a rule, especially in the bigger money tournaments, where, you know, if your rating crossed a certain threshold at any time in a rating supplement during the last 6 months or last 3 months or last year, then that determines your section eligibility. So, you know, that's another time when it becomes very, very handy, because just going through the US Chess regular website is kind of hard to get to the details of the different rating supplements without making a couple mouse clicks first.
And when you're talking about the cases where you're looking at their rating history, there actually is an area in the rule book. I think it's 22, E2C. Where if they have had that type of rating change, then you can actually assign a higher rating than what they're
28,
currently
isn't it? 28.
28. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's 28.
Okay. I know I used that in 2018 for the National Elementary. Caught a few people by surprise because they hadn't realized the rule was in there. Yep, 28 E2C. Where if the player's rating is dropped due to anomalous results, you can use a higher rating. And I used MSA when I was tracking down some of those. Mike had done some really good work in showing who had higher ratings within the past, I think you were checking the past 6 months at that time for the Scholastic Nationals. And using MSA helped us narrow in on those. As far as keeping everything goes, a lot of that is just in case you have to refer to it later. And the things I keep, for instance, are membership renewals, results sheets, buy requests, team designations, and of course, cross tables. I usually wait at least 3 months and often 6 months before I get rid of them, just in case I get an email later on saying, hey, what happened in this game? But that's all the documentation you're using during the tournament to manage the players. When someone says, why did you give this person a buy for this round? He never asked for it. You can look at it and say, yeah, he did. In some cases, people ask for it by mistake, but at least you've got the documentation showing that, yeah, you did have a reason for giving the buy because you were trusting what they said. Using the USCF forums, yeah, I'm going to change this to US Chess because it's been rebranded. That might bring a smile to Carol because she's more used to the rebranding.
Yeah, I find that very useful as you know, as a younger TD, was just looking at the different opinions that are out there flying around on matters, and then watching to see what some of the national tournament directors that are chiming in and that are saying, because a lot of us that are back at when I was a local and a senior TD, put something on there and don't have enough perspective, and then one of the national TDs will come in and kind of help settle the dust a little bit about kind of what's going on. And that's what I like about looking at the forums when it in the rules.
And that's when you find out when some even high-level TDs may not fully agree on exactly how to do things, and that disagreement may be very valid, because in some tournaments you might want to do one thing, and in other types of tournaments you might want to do another because that's more appropriate. But that's a place where if you have questions, you can ask them. And if you don't want to ask questions, you can lurk on the tournament forum and still learn a lot. I've seen all sorts of discussions on prizes, trophies, whatever, over the years, and they are available if you want to look back a number of years. I don't remember how far back they go. A little while back, I was looking at something from 2013, but that was like a few years ago. I was able to go back to 2013. Not sure how far back they go now, but even in the past couple of years, that's plenty if you want to look at all of the various conversations that have gone on. Now, as far as checking the buy and withdraw sign-up sheets, this is at some of the bigger tournaments. A small tournament might simply be someone coming up to the TD saying, hey, I'm not going to be able to make next round. But some of the bigger tournaments, the National Open, a lot of the CCA events, Chess Control with the National Scholastics, they'll have the forums available for all of those buy and withdraw sign-up sheets. And if you don't check them, you will end up pairing someone you weren't supposed to pair. And you will end up not pairing someone you were supposed to pair. Because if you miss a buy, you pair them, they don't play, you list it as a forfeit loss. And then when they come back from their previously scheduled absence, they find out that they're not paired because you thought they were out of the tournament. So please pay attention to those. Don't ever ignore them. And if you don't have something else already in place, please create some type of buy or withdraw sheet so that you aren't stuck with people saying, oh, I sent you an email or I sent you a text message, and you're not looking at your phone or your email at that time. You want something that in writing that you can always look at and use later to prove that someone really did ask for it. Now let's check everything, even the playing room arrangements, at least twice. That is essentially check everything. Some of the things to check are the trophies. Do you have all the trophies that you're supposed to have? Are the board numbers correct? You didn't double up any or skip any board numbers. The lighting in the rooms where the doors are. Squeaky doors can be the bane of chess players. If you have doors that make a lot of noise when they open and close, you're left with options of either leaving those doors open so they don't make noise and then getting the hallway noise, or having the doors make noise every time they're opened and closed.
Yeah, I usually tape a towel up across the top of the door so that when the door closes, it's, it doesn't close all the way, but yet it's still closed enough where it blocks out the majority of the noise. The other thing about trophies, it's not just, do you have the trophies? Do you have the correct labels on them? We have that happen at the Nationals pretty frequently, where you get one whole section and the labels are the labels on the trophies are mislabeled completely. So we had it happen at the K6 Nationals just this past, not too long ago.
And sometimes you're supposed to have 30 trophies for one section, 25 for another, and they're reversed.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know those in advance, you might be able to quickly get new labels, or at least realize that you've got trophies that you can give out and then mail the correct labels to the participants. Let's see. Where restrooms are is, of course, another thing to double check. And one thing I found out at a recent tournament, checking to see whether the restrooms are properly stocked at the beginning of the day can be critical, because that's not a surprise that you want to have happen later on. Let's see. 12, okay. And after a short time after the round started, check to see who's not arrived at their boards. Now, that might seem to be minor, because you can simply say if they didn't arrive, they get a forfeit loss. But the main thing this is for is to double check to see if you overlooked buys, or, as happened recently, see if someone is sitting in an inactive board instead of the board the player was actually paired at. When I had happened,
Yeah, especially with the little kids, sometimes they'll look at the wall chart and they see the number on the pair number, and they go sit at that board number.
Had a case recently where someone was supposed to sit at board 669, and the pairing numbers were written so that a 9 looked like an upside down 6. So they were sitting at board 699, which was not being used, which, when you look at it upside down, looks like 669. Granted, it was on a board numbering card that had both 699 and 700. So when they read 669, they would have read 00L for the other board number, but they hadn't noticed that. We got that person moved like 15 minutes after the start of the round, as we were trying to figure out what the heck is he doing sitting there. And if we hadn't been looking for things like that, you would have had 2 players each claiming a forfeit win because the other one never showed up. So check for things like that. Consistently dealing with the odd player is whether or not you're going to be giving buys to the players, or having them play X in an extra game section, or do cross-section pairings where one player is a house player in the higher rated players section. Also, it determines whether or not you want to take the odd man of each score group as either the lowest rated person, or allow an unrated person to be considered the odd man and drop down to the lower score group. What your decision is not as important as being consistent on it when anyone asks you later. As far as number 14 goes, if you can start the rounds on time, you will gain a lot of forgiveness in many other things. Parents, coaches, players don't want to find themselves they're 2, 3, 4 hours late. If you can start the rounds on time, you get all the players, coaches, parents starting out feeling better about how the tournament is running. I used to be involved with some tournaments where I was the floor chief, and the chief TD would make sure the pairings were perfect before starting the round, maybe 30, 40, 50 minutes late. Then we'd find out which players really were or were not here, who had missed the check-in, who had been checked in even though they weren't there, and we'd have to make a number of pairing changes. So when I took over as the chief TD, I decided I'm just going to start the rounds on time. And I had slightly more, not many more, but slightly more such pairing changes because I was just going to go with what I had at that point. I wasn't going to try to make everything perfect, but getting everything started so much earlier made all of the parents happy. A couple were a little bit upset because they were assuming they could come in 30 minutes late and the pairings not be there, but they learned fairly quickly. And when that was just for one tournament where they were slightly upset, and once they realized, oh, they're going to be starting on time, they were happy. As far as treating your TD job as a profession, if you do that, if you act professional, then others are more likely to think that you know what you're doing. Partially because in most cases, you really do know what you're doing. And it will also make sure that you are applying all of the diligence that you should be applying anyway. As far as 16 goes, this is a real quick one. You can't have more prizes than winners. Some people have inadvertently given both a place prize and a class prize to a player because, hey, he took third place. Oh, wait, he's also the top under 1,400, and they've done both. Just as a reminder, you can't do that. And it's just a little checkbox to make sure you avoid. Submit your tournaments online. This first went on this list a couple of decades ago when it wasn't as common. Now almost every tournament gets submitted online. I think there are still a few that are mailed on paper to the office, but almost everything goes online now. And one advantage of that is the online submission gives you a little warning if you have two players with very similar names, with same name and actually very similar ratings from the same state. It'll give you a warning sometimes saying, hey, this person is at a very different age from most of the field. Like one time when I had a 39-year-old playing in the K-6 section, got that warning, looked and said, oh, found another person with exactly the same name. I want to say Gregory McDougall, but that's not quite it, but that's close. Something relatively common enough that you can't expect to have multiples. And tracked it down and said, okay, here's the one I really needed to submit it under. And part of the reason that happened is that the parents just looked up the name and did not double check the ID number and assumed that the first name they saw was the correct one. Submit it online. You can avoid some of those issues right up front before anybody else sees it. This next one's a little bit interesting. You want to ask your accessibility challenge players what they need. Don't just assume that you know what somebody wants. Almost 30 years ago, there was a blind middle school player that did a lot of our local scholastic events, and he just wanted to be treated as a chess player that happened to be blind, not as a blind boy who happened to play chess. So he simply played, get mild accommodations that are necessary because he was blind. People would lead him to the boards, and he had his own board and could call out moves to his opponent. But other than that, he was just a regular player. He never asked for or wanted anything else as far as accommodations went. Then a downstate new organizer saw him and said, "Oh, I need to arrange for a special trophy for this blind boy that's playing in our event." And the TDs and the coaches immediately told the organizer before it went any further, "Don't do that." That would be almost an insult. Well, actually, it would be an insult to him because that's not what he wanted. And as it turned out, he ended up winning a trophy on his own that was just part of the regular field. We knew he was strong enough that he could do that, and he earned it himself without getting any type of gift, and that's exactly what he wanted. Recently, there was a young teenager in a wheelchair that did not want an assigned board, did not want the chairs moved away from the table. Teenager would actually transfer from the wheelchair to the chair during play. And with the mild exception of having to use the wheelchair access mini elevator to change levels to the tournament room, had no other issues at all as far as needing any type of accommodation. Now, 50 years ago, people would be shocked at that attitude. 25 years ago, people would think, "Oh, the teenager's being brave." Nowadays, it's just a normal thing to do. People's attitudes have changed over the years as far as accessibility goes. And you just treat those players pretty much the same as you would others after making sure that if they have any needs, you can handle them. I mean,
Yeah, I think when you run, a larger event, especially when it's an event that is going to attract people that are other than the players you normally have in your tournaments, that's when it becomes a good idea to put things as part of registration where you ask, if anyone has a special accommodation, please contact us before the start of round one so we can, get that taken care of. And that way you'll have the player who's got the diabetic pump and has to have the cell phone turned on the whole time so they can monitor their blood sugar. You get that taken care of, and you'll get the player who's got the broken leg that you didn't know had the broken leg, and the parents will get a hold of you, or the player will get a hold of you, say, "Can I sit on an end table, at the end of a row?" So, it's most of you direct tournaments where it's the same players all the time. But if you get involved in a tournament and you're an organizer, especially where you have a crowd that you probably have not experienced much before, that's when you have to start asking these supplemental questions and deal with issues with accessibility, because you just don't know what's going to come and what's going to show up.
like at the World Open, we had in the lower level, we had 4 different players that were in wheelchairs. So I asked each of them if they wanted an end row and if they wanted to sit in their wheelchair while playing or in a regular chair. Now, in that particular case, all of them wanted an end row to make it easier to access their board. We assigned them board numbers for that reason, and they all wanted the chairs shifted out so they could roll their wheelchairs up. But I wasn't going to make that assumption. I was going to check with them first before doing anything else.
Yeah, the other thing that's good to know about in advance is if you get a player who can't take notation because their arm is in a big cast, it just flat can't take notation, so that you can come up with the right accommodation and have it ready to go. Because what I really don't like is a solution where you got a young player with a broken hand and they can't write, and yet you ask the parent to sit there and record moves, because 9 times out of 10 the parent has no clue how to record the moves. And it just creates a problem. So you have to have thought through that issue beforehand, because there might be another parent who's a strong player or who definitely knows how to take the notation, and that parent might be willing to offer I'll do it for one round, but I can't do it every round, and we can kind of figure out what's going on. when we run our state championships here in Virginia, we have a volunteer pool of people, and that's one of the categories they would look for people that if we need somebody to take notation for a game, you know, that person can go do that.
And moving on to the next one, get a pairing program. I think I'll remove the S from this. When I first started back in '83, we didn't have pairing programs. So we would write everything on index cards and use those index cards to pair with. And I was an exceptionally fast manual pairer. People literally said that I looked like a Mississippi riverboat gambler dealing out the pairing cards. So I could do them fairly quickly, and by working the entire round, doing all the setup for each score group and partially pairing the score groups as each score group finished, I could have the final pairings done minutes after the round ended. Nowadays, on a pairing program, using pairing programs, I can also have the final pairings done minutes after a round ended, but the difference is I can work the floor for an extended period of time. I'm not stuck in the back room, and I can handle any last minute withdrawals, last minute half point buys, last minute late entries without having to redo all of the pairings. Pairing programs have gotten to the point where they're so useful that unless you have a small tournament or a tournament with only one round per week, if it's at a club that meets once a week, you really don't want to try to run without a pairing program. Another thing, when you have a pairing program, please make sure you know what the settings mean. At one of the state championships, I did an adult state championship. I had a backroom person who was the guy that wrote the pairing program. So he really knew it. And in the final round, in the top section, he turned to me and said, the pairings look really ugly. So I took a look at them, thought about it for a while, and then I totally redid them and told him these are the pairings you should use. And he looked at my pairings, changed one parameter in his pairing program, allowing interchanges, and then it gave exactly the same pairings I did. But if you don't understand those parameters, and if you haven't learned enough about manual pairings to be able to at least see issues like that, you won't notice such issues. And
Yeah, when I run tournaments and I've got really inexperienced TDs on the staff, once things get rolling, like into the third or fourth round and things are kind of moving smoothly, I'll make 10 or 20 pairing cards and give them to one of the TDs and said, go ahead and use that to pair round 4, you know, the top 2 sections or something. It makes them think through all the issues like definition and color alternation, and makes them think about the sequence of things. And there's nothing like using pairing cards. I mean, when I was brought up as a club TD and a local TD working in Massachusetts under a guy named Gus Goslin, that's what Gus used to do. He'd give me the pairing cards and say, pair the next round. And I really learned the pairings by doing that.
And I ended up getting involved with doing the manual pairings because the chief TD knew it would take him like 20 minutes to do pairings for the round, and he had to take a restroom break. So he went to the restroom, came back a few minutes later, and saw that the pairings were all done. And that's how I ended up becoming his backroom TD before pairing programs existed. It actually worked out fine for me because that gave me the backroom experience. Later, I got the floor experience when he bought the pairing programs, since it was on his portable computer. And back then, a portable computer would be something about this big. If you, I'm not sure if you can see me, but a portable computer back then would have been similar to the size of an older, small television. And you would put it on something rollable to move it around, and that was considered portable. He did that. I went back to the floor, gave me more experience, and then we moved forward. I moved forward with that, having experience both in the back room and floor.
Yeah, one thing that's helpful too is, if you, and it works best really in smaller tournaments, but instead of throwing away that wall chart after the end of the last round, save that rascal. Because if something happens to your computer and it goes down, you got that wall chart. It's got your color histories and your ratings of your players, and everything is on there if you've got it entered into your computer properly. And you literally can cut the different players out in the wall chart and use that as your pairing cards.
I usually do one final wall chart that's in the same sequence that you'd see in the sections when you submit it online and you're verifying it, because that makes it easier to double check. Find out that, oh, everything seems to match up, except that you've got a different name for this ID number than US Chess had. Usually it's a sibling issue where the parents flip the ID numbers for two siblings around. And you can take care of that fairly quickly, and you have your paper copy of the wall chart just in case you have a computer crash like Mike mentioned. Next one is listening to people. And this is sometimes hard for people to do. Don't close your mind to suggestions or information. I've made mid-tournament changes for things like science I've posted with helpful information based on suggestions people have made. It's also allowed me to avoid potential problems by checking on things after getting a heads up from somebody else. Then switching it over to dealing with TD rulings. If there's a dispute, make sure you listen to both sides. Personally, if your gut tells you that one person is probably wrong, that's the one that I will generally talk to first, because that gives them less time to make up an alternate version of the truth. But sometimes I found that my gut was incorrect, and I had to listen to both people to get all of the facts I needed to make a good decision. Finally, as far as parents go, I found 4 groups of parents at Scholastic tournaments. The first group is they're the ones that know what's going on. They have almost no questions, and they're very easy to deal with. They know what's happening. They don't have to ask you what's happening. Second group are the ones that don't know what's going on, don't bother asking any questions, and they're very easy to deal with because they're invisible, but they are also the most likely to end up getting frustrated, disgusted, and pull their kids out of chess and disappear permanently. Even though they're easy to deal with, that's not really the group I want the parents in. Third group, those are the ones that don't know what's going on, and they're determined to find out what's happening, so they'll ask a lot of questions. You can find yourself spending quite a bit of time with them, and I've done that a number of times in the past. And getting down to the next one, I've always responded with a relatively soft voice so that I'm treating them as questions instead of as confrontations. Even if they want it to be a confrontation, if I treat it as a question, use a soft voice, it generally transforms into a question and gets deconflicted. Anyway, when I'm dealing with them and I'm answering those questions, I have found that as time goes by, they transition into that first group, and not only do they do that, they know that because they had all those questions, they are often a first line of defense and will look for other parents that seem confused and give them the information that I might not have time to see that they even needed, and help avoid people in that second group. So that third group, even though they take time, they almost invariably save me much more time down the road and keep more other parents still interested and willing to stay. So yeah, some TDs get annoyed at that third group. I don't, and I don't think any TD should get annoyed at that third group, even though they might seem to take up a lot of time initially. The fourth group, those are just the ones that ask questions, hoping to get some type of answer they can twist in a way that benefits their kids. Fortunately, they seem to be a fairly small group, and that's just human nature. You'll have a few of those.
Yeah, Jeff, a thing that, I learned, and I really picked this up during the online play, was, a lot of directors would start having like a little town hall or a pre-meeting by Zoom or, some other online platform a few days before the tournament. And I do that in all my over the board tournaments now as well. And just have that online meeting and invite all the participants. Of course, you don't get the steely-eyed veterans there, they don't come, but especially the kids in the younger sections, the parents will want to dial in, and you'll get a lot of questions answered, in that type of a forum, instead of having to answer them on the floor. And it helps stop these cases that I'm sure we've all seen, where you got a 5-round tournament, and after the first round, there's one family's gone because they thought it was an elimination tournament. They didn't know what a Swiss system was. They thought it was elimination. So they're gone, and you're like paired the round, and there's a kid sitting there by themselves. And then you find out, you contact the parents, and well, he lost. We thought it was over, So
I think US Chess has incorporated that type of pre-meeting for their spring scholastics. They've got one of those on the website available for new parents. And might not be so much an actual meeting, but they do have one of those PowerPoint presentations that can goes through a lot of those issues for the new parents, so that they have a better idea of what's going on.
yeah, in mine, one of the questions I typically cover when I'm doing a presentation to the like the under 1400 section, or the under 700 section or something like that, is it's just a quick explanation about how the pairings work. Because they the parents will be like, why is my kid always playing kids that are higher rated than him? And then you show them, this is why, So.
Now, I will admit that during my initial announcements, I will hold up the rule book, actually physically hold up the rule book, showing the section that deals with how to play chess, which is held up with pages 5 through 18 vertical, and say, this is the section that we hope that all of the players know how to do. Then I switch to the section on how to play tournaments, which is the entire rest of the book from page 19 on. And I'll say that that's the section on how to play tournaments. If you have any questions for the TD, because we don't expect every player to know all of the rule book, please raise your hand and we'll resolve any questions. And I usually word it as resolve any confusion. That's also part, kind of transitioning into using a soft voice. Particularly for Scholastic, when you say that a tournament director is coming over to resolve any confusion, it keeps the people calmer, as opposed to saying resolve anybody resolve who's violating the rules. Because if you just say violating the rules, people are more inclined to think that someone's intending to cheat. If you keep emphasizing confusion, that indicates that there was no real intent to cheat. They just didn't know better. And with that soft voice, as we're transitioning to 21, as I said before, de-escalates the potential confrontations and makes it easier for people to feel that you're listening to them. At one of the high school tournaments, it also helps avoid calling attention to any issue that you're dealing with again when you're dealing with a coach. At one of the high school tournaments, I had a coach that said, touch move. It was a fixed board tournament that was like 6 boards down the table. It was an 8 board per team tournament, and the players hadn't even heard him. But using that soft voice, I went up to him and simply said, please leave. And when he looked at me in confusion, I just as softly said, now. And that's very soft. It's not getting angry or anything. It's just being firm and saying, yes, you do need to do this. I'm not going to call you out or anything. And again, the coach looked at me confused and just walked and left. And later on, I heard that he was talking to another coach, and he said he'd been coaching baseball and basketball for years. And the very first time he got ejected was his first year coaching chess. Caught him by surprise, but kind of understandable. Baseball, basketball, you expect the coach to say something from the side. He just needed to learn. If you remain calm, not only do the players and parents figure that you know what you're doing and you can resolve any issues, but any of your subordinate TDs can have confidence that you know how to handle things. And if you've got a lot of experience and actually do know how to handle things, that's just one more arrow in your quiver to be able to keep the tournament moving smoothly. Recent tournament, some of the registrations were misplaced or done incorrectly. And that's, of course, a crisis to the players that aren't getting paired for the first round. But when you say calmly that you will handle things after the round has started and take care of what you can, those players are no longer extremely perturbed. They're more willing to wait and see what can be done. And as a side note, when you have one player that has a problem, you have a problem. When you have multiple players that have a problem, you can often put them together and end up with a lot of solutions. So if you have that issue where you need to take care of last minute pairing changes to get players in, you should remain calm because they can be handled. Moving on to number 22. This is one that's very difficult for many people. If someone questions your decision or even seems to be getting upset, don't take it personally. A lot of times if someone's getting upset and you react calmly, they start realizing that whatever they're getting upset about can be handled. If someone's questioning what you did, listen. Going back to number 20, listen to them. And if they're interpreting things wrong, you can calmly explain why you made the decision that you made. If it turns out they're right and you overlook something, then you can work forward and resolve the issue. If you can avoid taking things personally, that can keep you calmer and thus keep your players and subordinate TDs calmer as well. Don't rush. When you try rushing, you're almost certain to overlook something, make some type of mistake in the pairings, not stop and get all of the information you need to make a good ruling. no matter how rushed you think you are, don't rush it. If that means that you'll have to tell someone they'll have to wait a few minutes before you can get to them because you're handling another issue, that's what it means. And if someone absolutely demands that they talk to you right then, just be firm and say that you will get to them right after you've dealt with another issue. Don't let them push you into doing something that without getting all of the information that you need to do it correctly. As far as number 24 goes, I've never done a perfect tournament. I have done a lot of tournaments that the players thought were perfect, because I've caught things before they became a problem. But I've never actually done a perfect one. There's always been at least some error that I've made, and I've looked and say, oh, I made this error, let's fix it before we post the pairings, whatever. Because to paraphrase an old saying, no plans survive contact with the reality. A lot of people say that becoming an NTD means you've either made every mistake or dealt with pretty much every mistake. It's not true. You never deal with all of them, but it seems like it. And have learned how to recover from that. And as long as you accept that nothing is going to always be perfect, you also have your contingency plans more or less in place for when something goes wrong. You know how to react to situations like that. When your subordinate TD gets sick and is not going to be at the tournament, you know what type of effort you need to do to compensate for that. When a player breaks an arm playing ball between rounds, you know how to handle the opponent who the player was paired against, and also how to handle it when the player comes back from the ER, because even though he's going to have to sit out a round, but while he's at the ER, he does want to continue the tournament, because kids are like that. They don't pay a lot of attention to a broken arm slowing them down. As far as number 25 goes, be prepared as kind of a follow-up to the nothing is perfect. Once you accept that nothing is perfect, you've got ideas for how to handle things when that imperfection occurs. Also, you want to make sure you've got all your forms and documents ready that you need, all the equipment that you need. Make sure you've got your staff lined up, all of your supplies. When I'm doing a fixed board tournament for high school competitions, I'll do all of the advance entries. And then during the check-in period, I'll have printed out a list of the fixed board teams and a second list of all the players in the individual open sections, so that I have my entries in the tournament for them to adjust when they do the check-in. And once I get that, I don't have to go in and say, oh, here's a list of what it is. Does it match what I've got? Since I gave them what I got to modify. Do everything you can in advance so that you can start the tournament quickly and you don't have any problems during the tournament that you can't otherwise, that you could have avoided. And I've added a few more as well. One is the 18G adjudication. That's when an opponent is absent or other reasons. Well, but that's particularly 18G1, when an opponent is absent. Sometimes there are other reasons. Remember that when you're doing an adjudication like that, it assumes that you're adjudicating based on best play by both players. Most people think that if you get an 18G1 adjudication because an opponent was absent for however long it was, then it automatically means giving a win to the player that stayed. Well, if they're asking for the 18G1 and it's in a dead drawn position, an adjudication would be a draw. And don't rush to simply give the win. Last significant one I had for that had an IM playing an expert, and the IM disappeared. I looked at the position was drawn. So I tracked down the IM and asked him if the game was over. And we said, yes. I said, your opponent doesn't realize that. He went back and agreed to the draw that I would have adjudicated anyway. And by getting him to come back, that made it easier to handle any potential complaint with someone saying, oh, he left. That means he loses. Well, not entirely true, but some people think that. The rule book often uses the phrase should not. I don't remember any case where it says must not. Now, the Rules Committee has said that should not really means must not unless you have a very, very, very good reason. They use slightly stronger language. The chair that said that used slightly stronger language, but that's what he meant. And an example of that is the rule saying that in those cases where pairings need to be changed after the round starts, then the TD should not make a pairing change in any game after Black's fourth move has been determined. In one national championship Scholastic, where the winner of each section got an invitation to another tournament, my backroom TD made a mistake in the final round and avoided pairing two teammates with perfect scores because the two players a half point below them had already played each other. And it's not so much that he avoided it. The pairing program said, oh, I can take care of both the team conflict and the rematch conflict by pairing the two perfect scores, not against each other, but against the two people a half a point back. That was a totally incorrect pairing and would have had a significant impact on the invitation portion of the prize for the winner. So even though the games were 8 to 12 moves in, I stopped the top 10 boards, looked at it, and then repaired the top 3 so I could have the two perfect scores playing each other, then the other two playing the people on board that were originally paired on board 3. That is something that a lot of TDs would not even have considered because it was definitely way after the determination of Black's fourth move. But the Scholastic Council members that were there said it was exactly what was needed and have requested that I include this story in every TDCC workshop just as an example of cases when should not really is not the same as must not, and when you should do something even though should not is listed.
Yeah, I know in FIDE, we purged all the shoulds and, made them shall or will and stuff like that. So.
And I prefer US chess because on occasion, not often, but on occasion, you actually do need to do something. And as far as that changing of the pairings, that's only with the TD changing pairings. If a player sits down at the wrong board and goes 10, 12, 15 moves, and in Scholastic tournaments, that might be in the first 3 minutes of the round, when the correct person shows up, the wrong game should be annulled, and the player should play the people that they were listed as playing. That rule only applies to when a TD changes a player changes a pairing, because players never really have the right to change pairings. Moving on to 21F3 is a rule about when you can't, there's a disagreement about what the facts are in a dispute, and a TD doesn't really have a good handle on which version is correct. and has to make a best judgment as far as which one to go with. And 21F3 does have a guideline saying that if you can't figure out which version to go with, then choose a version that allows play to continue. That will sometimes allow you to quickly resolve something that you might not otherwise be able to. I did that, used that in one game a little over a week ago. And by explaining that rule and why I was making the decision, that also eliminated any inclination of a player to even appeal the ruling. And finally, for TDCC only issue, pay attention to the size of the tournament you're allowed to be the chief TD of. I mean, if there are problems with the tournament and it's larger than you're supposed to be directing, then if there are such problems and TDCC has to look at it because there have been complaints filed, it looks worse for a TD because they're directing above their level. And from a practical standpoint, if a tournament's larger than what you're supposed to be directing, you may not be ready for it. Because I can remember one time when I was still a local TD, and I was the floor chief of the Saturday tournament. Friday night, the chief TD got into an auto accident and was hospitalized. So I ended up all of a sudden inheriting the chief role because couldn't get any other replacement in that short period of time. And I had a lot of difficulty with that tournament. The players didn't really notice it because I was used to working through difficulty, but it was extremely stressful for me. I leaned on some of the subordinate TDs quite a bit. And I do not think that at that time I was ready to function as a senior TD in a tournament that size, since I was still only a local TD. Now, since then, I've learned a lot more, but I've never forgotten that. And those size of the tournaments that are recommended for the TDs are there for a reason, because in a lot of cases, if you try to direct something too large, you have a very good chance of having difficulties. And that pretty much finishes. Well, we've got 12 minutes left. I thought I was talking faster. That pretty much finishes the presentation. So I am going to stop sharing my screen so I can see if there are any questions. Mike, have you seen any come along in the chat?
I mean, we've been answering a lot of them, but I would say if somebody has a question, they can raise their hand now with the raise your hand feature in Zoom, and you can ask a question.
I know I talked a lot. I didn't think I would have answered all of them.
I think Brian Yang had mentioned it, but on the US Chess homepage, I mean, mentioned it in the chat, but on the US Chess homepage at the very bottom in the black area of the screen, there's a place where you can click on for tournament directors. I mean, there's a whole bunch of great information there. And it's like, I think what Brian said, I would echo, is that I wish I had all this when I was a young TD trying to learn, because there's a wealth of knowledge, in that stuff. So there's lots of good things that you can pick up off of that page. I think Chris Bird put that together a while back. Is that right, Carol?
I don't know the genesis of it.
Yeah, I think Chris Bird might have put it together.
That's correct, Mike.
And that's the stuff down here where it says tournament directors.
Yeah.
And if you go in here, it shows a number of things. Some of it, of course, are the rule book, points to the TD affiliate area, TD certification, various information, videos, Tim Just columns, and
Eric,
a whole
I
bunch
think
of stuff.
Eric has a question. Eric Arnold, you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
There's been a lot of discussion in the chat about what software to use for pairings. And I guess one question I have is that I've been involved with the Frederick Chess Club in Frederick, Maryland, which is a very small adult chess club. Generally, our maximum, I think the most we've ever had have been maybe 25 players. And I guess my question is, are you guys used to seeing?
I guess Eric got muted.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Are you,
Okay, he's back. He's back.
are you used to seeing a scenario in which the club provides a laptop or software for the TD to use, or are you used to seeing a scenario where the TD brings their own equipment to run the tournament on behalf of the club? And that being the case, where's the money coming from? We have never paid TDs. All of our TDs have been volunteered. The volunteers, there's only 3 or 4 of us. We try and roll through, but I guess I'm not really clear. You guys keep speaking to large scholastic or national tournaments with floor walkers and all that. I don't know anything about that stuff. I'm looking for advice for your little local club that just runs small tournaments. And I guess I'd like you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, as far as small clubs go, my club used to do the pairings using pairing cards. Now, since then, we've gotten the club has purchased, used to purchase in the past, copies of WinTD for some of the TDs. And part of the reason the club did that is we used them at scholastic tournaments where we would charge the organizers some money. And the expense for the pairing TD was much less than what we were pulling in from the organizers to provide our TDs to the organizer. But WinTD and SwissSys are a couple of the big ones. Most TDs that I know of actually purchase it themselves. I have never purchased a laptop personally. I use the one from work, and work knows I'm using the work laptop for these chess tournaments. They're fine with that, because if there is an emergency while I'm at a tournament, at least I have my work laptop with me. And if necessary, I can go in and take care of things during the quieter periods of the tournament, instead of having them have to wait until I get home before dealing with something. A lot of people right now already have laptops, so I don't know how many clubs would be willing to provide a laptop to people. But some clubs might be able to afford it, and a lot of clubs would be just fine with pairing cards being used if the TDs have learned the pairing rules. I don't know, Mike, do you have anything else?
I couldn't find myself on the icons. Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Just somebody buys SwissSys.
I'm saying a lot of comments in the chat,
or WinTD, or WinTD. The only problem with doing that is, you're limited to the number of computers you can install that stuff on without violating licensing agreements. So you have to just be careful what you're doing. And if there's, because you don't need a really fancy laptop to put SwissSys or WinTD on. You can be running Windows 7 and work SwissSys. You don't need to have a behemoth with 32 gigabytes of RAM and an i7 processor, and you don't need anything like that. You can run it on an old old processor system. So yeah, I think for about $300 investment, a club can get a computer with the SwissSys software on it, and everything, and just that becomes the tournament. That becomes the tournament computer, if you will.
Mhm. Yeah, if your club is really strapped for money, if someone is willing to bring their laptop
Mhm.
with something installed, that's fine. Otherwise, again, look at pairing cards. So there were a lot of suggestions in the chat if you were checking that. And I'm seeing another question in the chat regarding what's required to renew as a local TD or whatever. And unlike FIDE, US Chess does not charge TDs to take the test or become certified at any particular level. Once you become certified at a level, you will need to take a test once per level at a minimum. For the club TD, it's after being a club TD for 3 years. For every other level, it's before moving up to that level. But as long as you're reasonably active after that and maintain your membership, reasonably active being an average of at least one tournament per year, you end up getting automatically renewed and you don't have to keep taking tests to move on up. Let's see, any other questions coming
Yeah,
up?
Vaughn Bennett. Go ahead, Vaughn Bennett in the
Yes, good evening. Great workshop. Thank you very much. The question I had was something you mentioned earlier regarding the writing of the moves. You said you were going to talk about the rule regarding the writing of the move first and or making the move first.
Yeah, I covered that not as a separate topic, but during the section on post it and announce it.
Okay. Okay.
Because there is a difference of opinion among various TDs on how to do it. And if you've decided that for your particular tournament, you have one certain way of doing it, you may as well post that that's what you're doing. I mean, some TDs don't care if someone writes first. They simply accept that. Others will give a warning. Some will just assume the standard penalty of awarding 2 minutes to the opponent, and others will actually have a time penalty for writing the move first. And sometimes it can be a steadily increasing penalty based on multiple violations that might ending up in a time penalty. If you have a particular way that you want to have that handled, have it posted at your tournaments, and you may as well put it on your website if you have one available where you can post things like that. So at least people know what to expect when they come to your tournament.
yeah, rule 15A, which is manner of keeping score, has a TD tip under there, and it basically says while the rules wording indicates you got to make the move first and keep the score sheet visible at all times, which brings in US Chess into alignment with FIDE. It's really a big change for players, so TDs are advised possibly a first, second, and third time to issue warnings to players that do not comply, with the writing the move down first. And I mean, just with kids, you got to get them out of the habit of that, because if they're going to go play, as they start getting better, if they're going to go play in a FIDE rated tournament, they're going to get called out for it instantly. I had it happen 2 weekends ago in the Virginia Open, where a younger player was writing the moves down first, and the opponent said, "You got to write your moves down first," and the kid was like, "Well, I don't do that." I said, "I'm sorry, you're going to learn how right now, because that's the rule. There is no exception with FIDE tournament." So,
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
sure thing. Looks like Tom Langland.
Yes, sir. I just want to mention it's actually on the tournament director link down there at the bottom of the US Chess page on the use of special referees. There are 10 of us throughout the whole United States. We are available on weekends. If you have questions, problems, anything like that, you can call us. You can use us instead of an on-site appeals committee. There's a couple of us on here. The average experience of the 10 people on that list is they're around 500 tournaments. So they've been there, they've done that. The link, you have to go to the TD affiliate area. They do want to try and keep our identity secret. So everyone doesn't have our phone number, okay? There also is an article in the May 22 Chess Life magazine, gives you more information about what we have available. And so you can, before you get in trouble and you end up before the TDCC about a ruling you made in a tournament, just give us a call and say, hey, I've got this going on in my tournament. Can you help me out here? We can give you suggestions. We can then act as a special referee and tell you this is what you should do, or help you make a ruling so you get it right. Most important thing for you to be doing at a tournament is to get it right. And you don't want to be facing the TDC later on for something you didn't do or anything else like that. So I just want to make sure you guys look for those special referees. You can go to the TD affiliate area. When you go in, there's a little button on there, orange button on the middle left-hand side. Select that, gives you a list of, there's 10 of us, their phone number, give us a call. All right, that's all for me.
And as far as special referees go, one of the reasons they were created was to make sure that when a TD gets appealed, you have someone of an appropriate level handling the appeal. I remember one time there was an appeals committee of a club TD, local TD, and senior TD. The club and local TD voted on one side, with the senior TD dissenting, to overturn the ruling that was made by the NTD chief and the, ANTD chief and the NTD floor chief. So a club and a local overruled a senior, an ANTD, and an NTD. Rules committee didn't want to have something like that happen again. So they say you should use an appeals committee of at least of TDs of at least the level of the TD being appealed. And if you can't get that on site, use a special referee.
Tom Rollins, go ahead.
Yes, hi, everyone. With regard to mentoring new TDs, I find that one of the big hurdles is finding a venue, the organizing side of the TD work. And I'm wondering if you have any resources or guidelines available for dealing with hotels and that kind of work.
Mike, I'm going to defer this one to you because I've always been a hired gun TD.
Yeah.
The only two tournaments I've organized are my club events.
I think the first thing I would do is look in the back of the scholastic regulations, because the US Chess National Scholastic Regulations has a checklist for sites, and that's a good starting point. Other than that, what I would do is try to, talk to your state chapter, your state affiliate, and talk to them about, who are some of the organizers in the state that you can talk to and get some, get some help from in terms of getting some tips. Because most of what I learned, I learned through the School of Hard Knocks, in terms of agreements with hotels and, all those kinds of things. So, but that's my recommendations to you.
And as far as mentoring TDs go, scholastic tournaments are one place where TDs are willing to start out. And what my club found is if you are willing to come in and work a tournament as the TDs, it's not uncommon to have multiple schools have people that feel that they can organize an event, they just don't know how to run it. And you can have multiple schools bringing in the same TD team to do multiple tournaments during the year. And at one point I was dealing with like 10 different schools in a school year, each of them organizing their own event.
Frank Delbonis.
Guys, thank you very much for the links in this helpful session. Speaking of places, I remember you mentioned, Mike, about Gus. He used to do them at Burger King's.
Yeah, that's where I did them, was at the Burger King.
And Legion Halls, wherever you could find it. So at college cafeterias. Anyway, I have a couple questions. One is because of COVID, and I've been certified for years. I wanted to get recertified, and I know there was a little break there. There was no tournaments in our state for like 2 years. Did they extend that to allow us to run the tournaments? Because
right now it's extended. Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's extended through the end of December of this year. Is that correct?
I am not certain.
I think it is
when it's extended through, but I do know that we did have automatic extensions during the height of COVID, and we were eventually going to start scaling that back.
Yeah, I'm
as
pretty
far
sure
as-
it's through the end of December.
And as far as those tournaments go, it's doing a number of events. It's not any particular size. If you run quads once a week, you can reach that number of tournaments.
Okay, and also, I had a situation, well, it might happen. Let's say I have, I don't know, 70, I'm expecting 50 players, 70 players, and the local TD, and that's what we have 120. So let's say 130 show up. What happens in that case? You're going over the limit there. What usually, you ever have that happen? Of course, you have it.
Well, I mean,
Now,
it's
you got two issues there.
It's
Uh,
reasonable, but you should, that's an issue of what Jeff said about prior planning. Especially when you see your numbers are starting to go up toward the end, you may say, oh boy, I need another TD. As a matter of fact, I just reached out 2 days ago because I'm running the Charlottesville Open, and I can do 200 players at a whack. I mean, I've done it before, but I don't like to. So I just contacted another TD and said, hey, you willing to come out and help? He's a local, he's going to learn. So he said, yeah. So that's what I do.
And if you get blindsided on site with a whole bunch of unexpected entries, the rule says that the number of players you expected to be
Right.
there. Now, if you're doing a tournament with a based on prize fund of 200 in your local TD, if you didn't expect to exceed 120, you're kind of pushing the boundaries and violating the boundaries.
I was
of
talking more
what you
about
could
Scholastic.
reasonably-
Scholastic, I was talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fine.
Okay. And the last question I had was real quick. I went to a tournament and there was a lot of odd numbers paired out students, and the TD just wanted to pair it really quickly. They had a couple of them on there. And instead of trying to maybe see, does anybody want to even up or maybe ask for do side sections, they just refused. They were rude to the parents, they were rude to the coaches. And in a situation like that, a lot of them were new unrated players and they were at the same rating, and they only got 3 games paired. So they didn't end up with a rating. And then those kids went to the nationals with me and they didn't have a rating, and they caused this just really created a problem. And I like what you said about you should try to deal with the odd player. I know they are not required to, but what do you do if you're a coach? And I'm actually a tournament director, and I went to another tournament, and these people were doing this. I mean,
There's not much you can do if the organizer or the chief TD is not willing to do it. But the technique that I've always found is I'll wait. If there's 5 or 6 kids that are oddballs in sections, I'll get them off to the side and then wait 5 or 10 minutes after the tournament gets flowing, and then do the pairings for them.
exactly.
Just quickly ask, what are you guys' ratings? Okay, you're gonna play you. You're gonna play you. You're gonna go play you. And then figure it out. And you can write it down in the pairing sheet later to collect it. But it's the trick is to get the kids to play in.
Right.
as
And I've
fast as
even
possible.
asked kids, anybody want to play up or down? And then makes all the even numbers. Well, we had 8 kids who didn't end up with a rating that day, 4 rounds, because they just didn't want to accommodate and not deal with the odd player. So I'm glad you did talk about it.
And as far as that goes, an extra game section, of course, is the easiest way of handling that.
Correct.
Of course.
But
yeah,
every now and then you end up with the situation I had where in the 4th round, an unrated player had an opponent forfeit against him. So what I did there is I found another player who finished quickly and arranged an extra game just so that unrated player could get their 4th game in
exactly.
and get an official rating.
I've done that too. Or if sometimes if they're in almost the same rating and the sections aren't really ending at the same time, you can't do it. But if they end at the same time, and it was so obvious to do this, and one of my kids was begging the TD, and he said no. I just was I'm sorry to just bring up this complaint, but really dealing with the odd player is important.
Mhm.
Dean Creech. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thanks again for doing this. Very informative. I don't want to belabor the point, but a follow-up question about writing down the move first is something that I've had occur is someone writes down the move, does a blunder check, crosses out that move and makes a different move. And To me, that's taking notes but maybe it's allowed, and there's a little tip in, at least in the rule book, that says they can do that once per move, is what another TD is claiming is okay. And I'm like,
That's a little bit more often than I would allow.
Yeah, same here.
yeah, they could do that up to one, as long as they don't, no, they could, as long as they don't do it more than once a move.
Well, I
then they
would,
say it's okay.
Well, no,
yeah, it's really a judgment kind of thing, but it's clear when a kid is erasing moves left and right, that's now taking notes. And that's also the time to just, tell the player, look, stop writing your moves down first, write your move, do your move, then write your move down. That's what the rule is for, is to try to stop that kind of thing. It's the same with some kids with their scholastic notebooks. Or players with their notebooks of games in between moves are flipping back, looking at old games, looking to see what they did in certain situations, and that's cheating.
As far as the once per move, that's really pushing it way too far. I might give a warning the first time it's done and maybe the second time. But if they keep crossing out the moves, eventually somewhere in the third or fourth one, I'll start doing the standard penalty of adding time to the opponent and later on start taking off time.
Okay.
Hey, Brian Yang.
That's been my interpretation. There's I'm not going to mention names, but there's another TD that's a senior TD, one level ahead above me, I think. And he claims that that's perfectly okay, as long as they don't do it more than one time per move. And I've never thought that was correct. So thanks for clarifying that. I mean, like you said, if he posts that as his rule for the tournament and everybody knows that, then that's one thing. But I've had players do it, not more than one time. Well, I have had players do it more than one time per move, several times, and it not be called. But another situation where someone does it, 3 or 4 times in the game, and it's obvious that he's using that as a blunder check. And so he admits that's what he's doing. And so
I know that
Brian?
personally, I might have a
Sorry.
few crossed out moves because I've simply written them down wrong. I always make my move and then write it because that's better on my clock management. I'm not writing on my time, but sometimes I'll write incorrectly and I'll have to cross it off and fix it.
So
yeah,
Okay,
that one I
Brian.
yep.
understand.
So so here's a TD tip. If you have a long line of people who are registering for your tournament on site, have a person be your last person, so you know who was the last person that was cut off for the registration. So with that, I say motion to adjourn.
When he said that, for instance, if your registration is up through noon, put someone at the end of the line at noon. And as people keep going into the line, obviously they came there after noon, unless they're late. I'll second the motion. Carol, are we all recorded?
Right, haven't stopped it yet.
Okay. I don't see any more hands raised. So I actually have to get to work tomorrow, and it's 9:13 for me, 10:13 for people on the East Coast, or even in Indiana. So I think it's time to call it a day.
Thanks, Jeff, for putting this
everyone.
on.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jeff.